This is the first of the two video lectures on Crossing Brooklyn Ferry by Walt Whitman. It is prescribed in PG Semester 4 syllabus of SKM University. Take a look at the picture given. It will give you a fairly good idea about what I am going to deal with. This is the riverside view with people on deck, men and women talking and taking their usual journey. Now, things to ponder. This picture has been taken long back, before the construction of Brooklyn Bridge, when people had to take a boat to cross the river. Since then, what things have changed? Has the sky turned permanent yellow? Or the earth flat? Or the river stopped its ebb and flow movement? Or have we stopped commuting or expressing our emotions? Think. Now, a brief biography of Walt Whitman. Known as the Bard of Democracy and America's poet, Walter Whitman or Walt Whitman is inarguably America's most influential poet, providing lines of continuity in the American poetic diction with major poets like Ezra Pound, Ginsberg, Louis Simpson, and others. He was born on May 31st, 1819, in West Hills, Long Island, New York. He came of English, Dutch, and Quaker ancestry and was the second child of Walter and Louis Van Welser Whitman. His mother was a Dutch and his father was of English descent. Thus, Whitman had both English and Dutch blood in his veins. Now, what is Quaker or Quakerism? The Quakers believed in the complete freedom of conscience and equality between man and woman, without caring even for the formal ceremonies of the church. Walt Whitman, as a boy, was greatly influenced by radical democratic views of his father and the Quakerism of his mother. Whitman had spent a great deal of his life, nearly 36 years, walking and observing in Brooklyn, New York City, and Long Island. Both the world of nature and the world of man impinged forcefully on the young boy's imagination. His childhood was generally restless and unhappy because of his family's economic status. His formal education didn't last long. Whitman left school at the age of 11 to help contribute to the household. He sought employment as an apprentice in a printing establishment and later worked as a journalist, teacher, and a government clerk. During these years, he had also read extensively at home and he began experimenting with a new style of poetry. His frequent visits to the theaters had developed in him a strong love of music, especially opera. The magnificent music and high melodrama of the opera made indelible impressions on his imagination, impressions that were to help shape the poetry of his masterpiece. Throughout much of the 1840s, Whitman wrote conventional poems, often echoing Brant and at times Shelley and Keats. In the late 1840s, a transformation was evidently visible in him, from an unoriginal and conventional poet into one who abruptly abandoned conventional rhyme and meter. He began at this time exploiting the odd loveliness of homely imagery, finding beauty in the commonplace, but expressing it in an uncommon way. The great epics of the past, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, Milton's Paradise Lost, and Tulsidasa's Ramcharitmanas, They had embodied the myths and fables of their ages and expressed the spirit of their times. Whitman found that such an epic was missing in America. A modern epic that would give voice to the national ideals and aspirations of America, and that would embody the 19th century myths, science, and democracy. And he ventured on his plan to make up for that deficiency through the great collection of poems, The Leaves of Grass. I would be doing great injustice to my students if I do not make a mention of Leaves of Grass. In 1855, he published Leaves of Grass, the book of 12 untitled poems that he wrote in the early years of the 1850s. Whitman paid out of his own pocket for the production of the first edition of his book and had only 795 copies printed. The work was an attempt at reaching out to the common person with an American epic. This book was an extraordinary accomplishment. Whitman now turned to address such social issues as education, temperance, slavery, immigration, democratic representation that challenged the new nation. It was a kind of experimental verse cast in unrhymed long lines with no identifiable meter. Although written in free verse, certain sections of the collection approached iambic meter. Now, what is free verse? Free verse is an open form of poetry. It does not use consistent meter patterns, rhyme, or any musical pattern. It thus tends to follow the rhythm of natural speech. Leaves of Grass was an uncanny combination of oratory, journalism, and the Bible. This new voice spoke confidently of union at a time of incredible division and tension in the culture. It spoke of its motley music, its new technologies, its fascination with science, and its evolving pride in an American language that was forming as a tongue distinct from British English. On March 26, 1892, Whitman passed away in Camden, New Jersey. Right up until the end, he had continued to work with Leaves of Grass, which during his lifetime had gone through many editions, nearly 8, and expanded to some 400 poems. He is aptly called the national poet and the later day successor to Homer, Virgil, Dante, and Shakespeare. And now, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, the poem prescribed in your syllabus, first appeared in 1856 in the second edition of Leaves of Grass under the title Sundown Poem. It received its present title in 1860 and was included in the Calamus section of the Leaves of Grass. Whitman revised the poem through the various editions. It describes the ferry trip across the East River from Manhattan to Brooklyn at the exact location that was to become the Brooklyn Bridge. His river experiences were specially connected with ferries. In this, he looks at ferries and ferry riding from a quite different perspective. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry is a long poem in 9 sections, and it ranks very high in the poetry of Whitman. A simple, ordinary experience is dramatized in such a way as to symbolize the mystic unity that pervades all mankind and the universe. It can well be compared to Tintern Abbey and Frost at Midnight. Its theme is the basic oneness of life, for all are born into this existence out of the same. All are involved in the same scenes and sights, and the same activities of this material world, and hence all humans are united in their common experience of life. This he made quite clear from the outset, that he sees in all things and I quote, a simple, compact, well-joined scheme. It is a very visual poem conveying a strong sense of particular detail. Many critics have compared it to painting in its effect. It is also richly symbolic, and its symbolic implications arise from the setting and images. The first section of the poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Let me read out the section first. This is the first section. Flood tide, below me I see you face to face. Clouds of the west, sun there half an hour high. I see you also face to face. Crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes. How curious you are to me. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, are more curious to me than you suppose. And you, that shall cross from shore to shore, years hence, are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose. This first section establishes the setting of the poem. The speaker describes his daily commute on a ferry running between Brooklyn and Manhattan at the end of a working day. It is also the daily experience of a mid-19th century New York ferry rider. This may appear mundane enough to most, but glorious to Whitman. The poem says nothing about the poet's reason for crossing the river. Please note, the focus is not on a purpose or destination, but on the act of crossing itself and the surrounding spectacle. He begins by describing his surroundings, the river, the ebb and flow tides below, the clouds, the sun above, and the commuters around him. Though all of the passengers are following their ordinary daily ritual, the speaker finds them to be curious, strange, as so removed from him that he cannot understand them. Note the lines, and I quote, crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes. How curious you are to me, unquote. He thinks about all the people who have made this journey in the past and how many are yet to repeat it long into the future. This thought carries him into a profound meditation on the connection between the past and the future and between the various generations of men. The ferry symbolizes the spatial and temporal movement. It is also associated with the groups of men and women who ride it, who have ridden it, and who will ride it. The coming together of these men and women symbolizes the spiritual unity of men in this world. Now, the second section of the poem. The impalpable sustenance of me from all things at all hours of the day, the simple, compact, well-joined scheme, myself disintegrated, everyone disintegrated, yet part of the scheme, the similitudes of the past and those of the future, the glories strung like beads on my smallest sights and hearings, on the walk in the street and the passage over the river, the current rushing so swiftly and swimming with me far away, the others that are to follow me, the ties between me and them, the certainty of others, the life, love, sight, hearing of others. Others will enter the gates of the ferry and cross from shore to shore. Others will watch the run of the flood tide. Others will see the shipping of Manhattan, north and west, and the heights of Brooklyn to the south and east. Others will see the islands large and small, 50 years hence, others will see them as they cross, the sun half an hour high. 100 years hence, or ever so many 100 years hence, others will see them, will enjoy the sunset, the pouring in of the flood tide, the falling back to the sea of the ebb tide. This second section begins to move us towards the sense of the eternal moment. The ebb tide and the flood tide movement, that is, the to and fro movement, is continually referred to in the poem. Notice, the first section of the poem moves closer, as in the intimate address, and then farther away in the second section, where Whitman begins to list a series of meditative observances. Many separate individuals, note the word, I quote, disintegrated, are traveling. They are united through the same experience. Thousands of people would have crossed the river in the same way in the past, and thousands of men and women will be crossing in the future. The ancestors had experienced the same sight, and the poet's posterity would do the same. With phrases like, and I quote, the similitudes of the past and those of the future, unquote, and, I quote, the others that are to follow me, the ties between them and me, unquote. He creates a rocking motion within each line. Notice the anaphora. They mimic the movement of the boat and the ebb and flow of the tides. In this way, the poet establishes a connection. He sees what he says, and I quote, a well-joined scheme. This refers to the things in nature. All are different and separate identities, yet there is harmony and universal identity. The poet praises the smallest sights and hearings, to quote from the poem, and thinks around him as glories. The glories, strung like beads, the objects of his perception, are compared to beads on a necklace. It also suggests continuum of time. In the next segment, I shall take up the remaining 7 sections of the poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, for explanation and analysis. If you have any question, you can write it in the comment box. Thank you.